No, firstly, thank you very much to Ahmed and everyone at 249, not only for having me today, because I'm genuinely very, very pleased to be here, but also having been so good in all the work that you do with respect to the general Sudanese entrepreneurship and startup scene. So it's really genuinely very positive to see. So thank you for having me. As Ahmed mentioned, what I was thinking of doing is effectively a short presentation on the things that I've learned and I've seen and continue to do see as, I suppose, an international investor working in Africa, and then discussing the extent to which I guess that's applicable to, say, markets like Sudan, which I'm aware now for the first time is gaining that exposure to international investors, which other parts of Africa are beginning to see. If at any point there are any questions, which I'm aware we'll kind of get to at the end, but if anything doesn't make sense or you want more information on, do just shout and stop me. I think we're a nice enough sort of size that we can be relatively conversational. I've met quite a few of you already, and I'm sure I'll meet the rest in due course, so we can be quite familiar. But just for context, so I do work with two companies that sort of overlap in terms of personnel, so they both kind of cover different ends of the same spectrum. The first of which is Adverse, which is blockchain focused, so it's an early stage African blockchain investor, and importantly, an accelerator as well, because not only do we invest in companies, but we also have an accelerator program, which effectively seeks to pair them up with experienced mentors from a tech perspective and sort of a more general business development perspective, with a view of taking them up to a more advanced level in the business life cycle. It's a joint venture between the Cardano Foundation, which is a layer one blockchain, and Everest Ventures Group, which is like a Pan-Asian tech fund. And we've invested in 15 companies across Africa since 2021. So we're quite aggressive as far as investment goes. And then the other is Future Hub, which is kind of more general when it comes to disruptive tech. So if there's some tech involved and it's African, we'll have a look at it. And it's a venture wing of Transsion Holdings, which is like Chinese telecoms. So they like to bring a lot of their resources in to incubate companies. So it's typically more early stage than Adverse, and slightly slower when it comes to approach. So I guess just as a general overview to begin with, I don't imagine I need to spend too much time on this because it is to a certain extent common knowledge, but I think it informs the rest of what I've got to say. So I wanted to highlight it, is that actually Africa as a market, when it comes to investment and in particular venture funding, is doing incredibly well. If we look at this first graph here, what we see over the past year, and actually past 2 years if we were to extrapolate it, is that whereas every other region of the world has been declining when it comes to venture funding, Africa has been increasing. Not only increasing, but actually exponentially growing by up to 150% quarter on quarter. So whereas COVID, economic downturn, inflation, recession is affecting every other market, Africa remains pretty resilient, which results in the $7 billion of projected funding by the end of the year, spread across 900 deals. That's sort of what we're heading for at the moment. So the market's incredibly bright, but I think we're seeing more and more big international investors setting up Africa desks, focusing on African companies, and actually really shaping their strategy to incorporate African businesses. And I think what's particularly exciting about that, which I guess overlaps to a certain extent with a lot of what 249 do, is that 81% of these 900 deals is in the tech sector. So it's very, very tech heavy. And if we look at the rounds of 100 million plus big rounds, late stage raises, 13 are in financial tech, whereas 2 are industrial and one is in consumer. So there's a very heavy emphasis on technology and technological solutions. And out of those, 5 new unicorns have been produced. And just a quick note as well, if we actually look at the geographical distribution, when we talk about African tech, we typically talk about Nigeria, we talk about Kenya, South Africa, but Egypt is doing incredibly well, again, in sort of the conventional fintech sector, which lends itself quite well, I think, to the prospects of Sudan, being a country which is fundamentally north of the Sahara, at least in terms of classification when it comes to markets. Because again, there is this investor appetite to look at the region and actually invest in it. So very promising. So what I kind of want to just quickly run through as well is these kind of 5, what, why, who, and how. From an international investment perspective, how do you attract investment? What are investors looking for? And the first thing I'd just point out, which I kind of come to at the end, is that fundamentally it's a question of marketing, right? It's how you present the actual business and the company. Because I think across the continent and in Sudan in particular, there are a lot of very strong companies. And I think it's a question, and very strong founders, and it's a question of just how you sort of present and package it in a way which is actually going to really switch on and engage prospective investors. So the first area I always look at is what, which is what are you building fundamentally? And the key point here is clarity and simplicity. The idea of avoiding building for the sake of building. Let's look at blockchain, for example, or fintech. A lot of people decide to build a payment platform or something involving tokens or something that involves the transfer of money. A lot of the time, they're very solid use cases, but in many instances, particularly in sort of the more established fintech markets, we see people building because there are buzzwords, because, oh, it's fashionable. That seems to attract the funding. But the problem is as we'll get on to in subsequent slides, there's a lack of use case there. And it's very actually difficult to expand and drill down as to why you're building it. Now, from the conversations I've had here in Sudan, at least, it seems that there are much stronger use cases, particularly in sort of the financial services sector. So I think that this is perhaps less relevant. And a point, as I mentioned, as well, is simplicity, which is when discussing these ideas and presenting them, be very concise about it. Insofar as if you can't explain what you're trying to build and why you're trying to build it in a sentence, it probably needs to be rethought. And particularly if you're speaking to investors as well. Investors want to see you succeed typically, but they don't always have the time to really deep dive into a product. It should be quick, simple and easy. And by and large, if an investor can't understand it after a couple of sentences, neither will the average customer. So that's important to consider. And then finally, you need to develop a vision as well. When presenting these ideas, what's the story? What's the narrative? What's the end goal? How are you going to scale? Because to have a kernel or a seed of an idea is fantastic, but obviously that seed needs to grow into something more substantial. And having that long-term view, even if it's not concrete or solid, is incredibly important because, again, when investing, you're looking for long-term growth as well as sort of the short-term return. So it's important to keep that in mind. So then we move on to why, and it overlaps to a large extent, which is why you're building it. So what's the reason that it exists? Because when I mentioned in the previous slide that there's a real trend, I think, in many, particularly tech sectors, just to build for the sake of building, which is a great virtue in itself, but not always the best from a business perspective. It's very important to establish what's the reason for the product's existence. Now, that's not to say that everything needs to have a really clear use case, because of course some of the most innovative products we see are often very creative. They often are in sectors that we wouldn't describe as essential. But in both, say, reactive, that is to say, here's a problem, I'm going to fix it with a solution, and innovation, which is, hey, I think this is really interesting, there is something which underlies it, which is this is what I'm trying to achieve, what I'm trying to get to. And I think particularly within African markets, and again, Sudan, from the conversation I've had recently, there are clear pain points when it comes to, say, moving money, foreign exchange, spending, purchasing power. They're there and they're very obvious and they're felt by everyone. So being direct and clear about these pain points is incredibly important. And again, as I mentioned initially, it's very much a marketing question, right? Insofar as it's all there, but it's just when you have these conversations, being very open about this is what we're solving, this is how we're solving it, and this is what we intend to do in future. And linking to that as well, there's also the question of does it need to exist? Insofar as building for the sake of building, think about what the actual underlying is. And then a final point on the why as well is why do you need the funding? And I've had a conversation with a couple of people actually about this, which is that there's a real tendency, I think, in the wider startup sort of ecosystem and market, particularly like newer markets, to think, right, I've been in existence for 3 months, we've got some early revenue, got a few customers, I want to raise 100 million. While noble and I appreciate the sentiment, it's the wrong view to take, because to my own detriment, I'll be very honest with you, investors are very devious. You shouldn't trust them because whenever there's a give, there's also a take in return. So when they give you money, they take equity and you lose control of your business. And also just from I guess a sales point, bootstrapping is fantastic. So I think I said to Ahmed when we first met that one of the reasons I was so interested in the Sudanese market is because for so long it's been cut off from dollar VCs. So we look at, say, the likes of Tihal. It's been bootstrapped for so long, and that creates incredibly resilient business models. So when you come to invest as an outsider, you see the use cases, see the resilience and the ability to generate revenue aside from just having cash pumped from the outside. So that is really important to consider as well. And also, indeed, the fact that don't give away too much too early, basically, if you don't have to, as attractive as sort of the whole unicorn YC dream might be. And then just the last couple of points as well is who. And something that I don't think is discussed enough is the team. Investors always look for the team. If you have a co-founder, it's co-founder synergy, because you hear a number of horror stories really within the startup space, and particularly within Africa from what I've seen, which is you've got two co-founders, perhaps arbitrarily paired together. They might have found each other on LinkedIn. Things go well at first, but then they differ in terms of vision and outlook. One of them has all the passwords, the access to the bank account. They have a nasty breakup, as we might say, and someone's cut out, half the product's gone. And again, from an investment perspective, it just looks terrible, because if you can't rely on basic co-founder synergy, how can you rely on the wider business model? And related to that as well is this idea of don't build it alone, because it seems very noble to be sort of a sole founder, to build everything yourself. But when you come to scale, it's incredibly important to have a CTO, to have a COO, to have a CMO, CEO, even in fact, if that's not yourself. Because serving 10 users is very different to 100 users, and 100 users is very different to 10,000 users. And I think as you grow as a company, these pressures will become more acutely felt. So again, when looking at prospective investment, it's great to see that those technical, in particular, support networks are present, so that, again, these companies can scale. And again, on the who point, KYC, I call it know your customer. I say don't look at markets, look at customers instead. So it's one thing to say, well, I'm going to develop this to serve the Sudanese financial market, but what is the Sudanese financial market? Because I imagine amongst you, your financial needs and wants and use cases are very different to someone on the street, for example. So being specific about what you're building not only makes it much easier for yourself, but I think also from an investment perspective, makes it much clearer insofar as what will the returns be, where will they be from, and what kind of returns can we look like? Because it's much easier to know a customer than it is to know a market as a whole. And again, linking to that as well is the use case. As in, why should a customer use the product? Why should an investor invest in the product? It's again creating that story and creating that narrative, which is always very helpful to see when evaluating a company. And again, just a final point, which is the actual how. And it sort of links again when I said initially, what is the product and what does it do? You know, how does it work? You should be able to explain how it works in a sentence, really. Because again, if the investor can't understand how it works, well, that's a problem, but it also likely means the customer probably won't understand how it works. And that's also an issue. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that the customer and the investor needs to intricately understand how things actually go. I mean, if you asked me to explain in detail how my phone worked, I probably couldn't, but it works nonetheless. But I have enough of an understanding that I'm able to trust the process and trust the system. Again, simplicity is key. Being clear not only with what you're building, but indeed how the value chain is created is hugely important. And then linking to what I was saying as well in terms of scalability. What's the future plan? How is it going to scale? How are you going to go from, say, the 100, 1,000, or even 10,000 users to the 1 million, 10 million, etc.? There needs to be a story there with it. And the in-house point is a very important one as well, insofar as particularly within Africa, where there are often peaks and troughs, we might say, of tech talent. It's very attractive and very tempting to outsource a lot of your development work to, say, a place like India. You go on Fiverr, talent marketplaces, you can hire freelancers. The problem with that is, and again, it's very difficult from an investment perspective, is you see the pitch deck and you see that, I don't know, the 3 founders are Sudanese and the rest of the tech team are, say, outsourced to India or Pakistan. What that means is that if those guys who you're paying, say, by the hour or by the week to do the work decide one day, can't really be bothered, I'm not sure about this one. Again, they take the passwords, you lose months worth of tech work. And again, it's simply not sustainable and doesn't bode well for the actual business model. So although difficult, keep as much in-house as possible. It kind of goes back to the team point, really creating that solid use case and a holistic business sense. And then the final point, again, a very basic one, but people sadly often forget it, is your solution a legal one? You know, are you breaking the law? Because particularly when it comes to disruptive tech and tech solutions, there's a real, I think, tendency of maybe less so in Sudan, but more so in other parts of Africa to think, well, this is pretty revolutionary. Regulators can't catch me. I'm just going to go ahead and you know, start dealing in FX or facilitating money transfers without a license. The problem is, again, if you're looking to attract investment, no one's going to want to touch that because it's not scalable. Going back to this point of scalability. You're not going to be able to serve the maximal number of users if what you're doing is illegal or otherwise a grey area. So working with the general trajectory of policymakers and being clear about the licensing and the permits you either don't have or need is incredibly important. And then just a final slide as well, which kind of the marketing and the presentation point as well. It's the idea of make everything very, very obvious. So this is a company, so AfriX, we invested in them early this year. Effectively, it's a crypto bank for emerging markets. They're based out of Nigeria. It's a money transfer platform. They use stable coins to facilitate the movement of money cross-border very quickly. This is the first page of their pitch deck. Immediately, you've got revenue, you've got volume, you've got month-to-month growth. I can't read exactly, but I assume that's what they are. In any case, you've got the metrics there. If I'm looking at that as an investor, I don't need to dig for them. I don't need to look for them. It's incredibly obvious that these guys are doing very well. These are big numbers. And so, as I mentioned, stats, metrics, and traction make the job easier for the investor. I mean, investors want you to succeed. It's in everyone's interest to find great companies, but it's just actually making it there and obvious, such that you don't have to dig for the information. And then just a last point as well, and I don't want to sort of talk about things that are too simple, but these things do make a difference in a weird way, which is when you come to have the Zoom meetings and calls, etc. It sounds stupid, but put your camera on. And the reason I say that is because at least, particularly in Nigeria, where I do most of my work, it's real tendency, whether it be due to internet or just general fashion, to not have the camera on and keep everything monotonous and quick. But again, if they're asking for $500,000 and you're an international investor who's never met these guys, it's quite uncomfortable to try and, particularly in Nigeria, give $500,000 to someone who I don't even know what they look like. Establishing relationships in all walks of life is very, very important, I think, particularly when it comes to actually working with investors. So, I mean, I don't want to kind of patronize people by saying it, but it's just something that I always find to be a particular bugbear. And also then with that as well, as a company, assume the investor knows nothing. As I've mentioned, these guys, devious, assume they've not read any of the material, they've not read the pitch deck, they've not paid any attention to what you're doing. Start from square one, and it makes the whole thing a lot easier. Everyone's on the same page. And then finally, as I said, tell the story as well. That idea of narrative scalability, where you're going with the product, because assume these guys don't know the market as well. They may know nothing about Sudan, about the financial situation, the pain points. So really fixing everything into a wider framework, I think, is incredibly important. So I mean, hopefully that's a sort of a useful overview, at least, of the things I've picked up on and what I've seen work and not work. That should maybe give a couple of points of insight to you all. So thank you very much for listening. It's much appreciated.
Thanks so much, William. I think we're just going to have some conversation.
Yes.
Some Q&As, and then we'll be open up for everyone. I think the first question that everyone would be having in mind is, what are you doing in Lagos, and how it ended up with you working out of Nigeria and Lagos?
Well, so my interest has always been in frontier markets and emerging markets, because I think that actually within those markets is where you can have the most amount of impact from a business and an innovation perspective. Because I think with sort of frontiers comes opportunities, and that's most acutely, I believe, seen in Africa. So with that in mind, Lagos and Nigeria is the place to be. So I mean, if we looked at the metrics I shared earlier when it comes to the amount of investment, the amount of innovation, and also the talent at the moment as well, Nigeria is very much the focus for it. I mean, more widely, in terms of my journey to get there, it was a combination, as I mentioned, of an interest in markets like Nigeria, but also the technology which you see flourishing there. It was initially blockchain, but has kind of more spiraled into a wider disruptive tech scene. Because if we look at Africa, and Sudan is a great example, the pain points that are there make the idea of real-world solutions to real-world problems really quite acutely seen. And I think that's incredibly exciting. So yeah, that's sort of how I ended up there. To a certain extent, but I think it's more than that insofar as it's opportunity, because you can actually see the effects of innovation far more acutely. Because it's always a funny story. I tell this to people. I try and stay away at least from the whole let's take blockchain scene in North America and Europe and Asia, because you come across these like the metaverse projects, NFT projects, which are like fine in themselves, but it's a bit abstract. Very clever guys doing them, but they don't really mean an awful lot. Whereas when you can come, say, to Nigeria, to potentially Sudan as well, and you see, well, this platform is facilitating the movement of money here, it's doing all of this revenue and helping these people pay in, whatever, I think it's a far more interesting sector to be in.
Right. I think the second question would be, so lots of people, when they compare, even here, I believe in Sudan, Sudan is very hard, and you have been to Nigeria, been to different countries around. Do you really believe that Sudan is that hard of all countries that you just had a couple of days in around, or you believe that every country really have their own struggle? Like let's take Nigeria for example, in terms of competition, infrastructure, fraud, all this stuff.
No, absolutely. I mean, I think that, I mean, from the time I've spent here, which admittedly has been limited, and from the time I've spent elsewhere, I don't see Sudan, particularly now, the way things are going, as being any more difficult to do business or invest in than any other country in Africa. I mean, what I always say about Nigeria, for example, is that although we see it leading the way in terms of investment, in terms of innovation, the problems there are very huge and very acutely felt if you are actually on the ground. So the idea is that Nigeria could be doing 10 times what it is now. And I think taking that principle, say, to Sudan is very, very similar, whereby all it needs is a small step forward, which is what seems to be happening now in general, to start doing incredibly well. So I think if we see these business models working elsewhere, then there's no reason Sudan can't do the same very soon.
And just from also initial observation, like I've been here, you tried different things. And then you came up with some interesting insights. Have you seen this before, this replication of Uber-like business model Airbnbs and then across African countries? And the question is, should we replicate and then innovate, or we just do something from the scratch? What do you believe is the model that you have been seeing repeatedly happening across Sub-Saharan?
Well, I think it's a very interesting question, because I think there's a real temptation, particularly from those who live and work outside of Sub-Saharan African markets, to say, look at Europe and say, well, what works here? I'm just going to try and transplant it to Africa, which works in some cases, but in many cases it doesn't work, because not only across Sub-Saharan Africa, but also in each market and amongst each customer or sector, there are very different needs, very different wants. So whilst in principle, let's say these ideas of digitization and sort of mobile focus are incredibly important, I don't think we can take a one-size-fits-all policy. Now, what's really interesting, I think, about, say, that digitization and the focus on, say, mobile phone technology, is that because so many parts of Africa haven't necessarily had, say, traditional banking infrastructure as Europe or North America has, or the kind of evolution to that tech, a lot of the underlying assumptions aren't there. So I think, if anything, actually, startups can go further in their initial steps than, from an innovation perspective, than they have been able to elsewhere. So combination of the two, I guess.
You see in Sudan, maybe you talk with different of these entrepreneurs in the past 2 days. How many years back you believe Sudan is compared to Cairo, compared to Johannesburg, or like Nigeria? Do you believe it's like 10 years back, 5 years back, 1 year, maybe advanced? I don't know.
It's yeah. I mean, because I must admit, I suppose it's slightly difficult to say, because I mean I've only really been in and active in Africa over the past year or so. But from what I've heard and understand of these big centres of investment, I'd be reluctant to say that Sudan is necessarily behind. I just think it's much like many other parts of Africa. It's not unique to Sudan at all. It's just at a different point in the I guess direction of development. So whereas in some other parts of Africa it might be a regulatory issue, it might be an infrastructural issue, I don't think at first glance those two are necessarily a problem in Sudan. What Sudan could be requiring, for example, is more, say, engagement from the entrepreneurial community with each other, and with, I know we had a conversation 2 days ago about university grads, computer science, engineering, think of entrepreneurship as a viable path out. So it's difficult to quantify as such, but I mean, I think the next, say, 5 years typically will be very interesting.
Yeah, so like 5 years back behind.
Well, maybe, I don't know.
It's fine. We are happy with the 5 years. Yeah. We had a very interesting conversation about how mobile money, or like these fintechs, is happening. And then Sudan had been like the largest to start with the moment, raising funds and basically a fintech in Sudan. I mean, do you believe these are basically following the trends around Africa, Flutterwave and others, or you believe this is really where the interest of the startups in Africa happening? It starts with fintech and then it goes through the other market.
Yes, and I'll be more concise in this instance and say yes, absolutely. Insofar as fintech, I think is the most important sector for any startup economy, because people need money, they need to spend money, they need to send money, and they need to deposit money, within the wider kind of banking system. But of course, there aren't always banks to go to. So I think provided that money remains an important part of people's lives, so will the tech behind it. So yeah, absolutely. And again, talking of pain points, the most acute pain points that at least I've seen are often financial and money related. So solving those first, I think, opens the door to further innovation and ecosystem engagement. I mean, as I mentioned just before, the idea of creating entrepreneurship as a viable category will and has been very much led by these success stories. So where, for example, there is fintech innovation, there will inevitably be further. Yeah.
I'll ask some question. Just more of there's no yes or wrong. Just more of the observation in that. So, for example, we always struggle to define what average seed or pre-seed size would be in Africa or like in Sudan. Just from your going around, I understand you're funding like a minimum of $100,000 check. To on a specific valuation, 6 or 7% equity. Is that valuation and ticket sizes just for blockchain, crypto type of businesses, or this is across different sectors? Like how are you seeing the actual valuations game across Africa?
Of course. So I mean, just in terms of the ticket size and what we do, I mean, I think some of the information on the website, we've kind of moved slightly beyond it. So we're now more flexible insofar as we'll go as low as 50K or potentially as high as 2 million, depending on the situation and the round structure. In terms of valuations, I mean, I think although Africa is doing very well when it comes to investment levels and the capital going into the continent, valuations nonetheless, particularly in the fintech and blockchain space, I think have gone with the market more generally, such that I think there is a general reservation to raise too high. I mean, the exception is Egypt, which is very interesting because that really has in the past 5 years opened its doors to international investors. So you have all the Gulf and the Saudi guys coming in and just pumping up valuations. But it's important to consider that that's not necessarily healthy. Although particularly as entrepreneurs, you might think, I want a 1 billion valuation as quickly as possible. It's not always a good thing. So in terms of general trends, I think sort of caution and cautiousness is what we've observed at least. But again, it's very much on a case-by-case platform, market-by-market basis too.
You mentioned the Middle East, Saudi, Emirates pumping in money into that and increasing the valuations. With the current what's happening in the world in terms of less money and all the financials going down, and we're seeing some big companies, startups laying off employees, raising less round than it used to be in the past. Do you think this really affected the business, at least out of the big 4 countries, or is this going to affect them more? Or do you believe that Africa was really behind in terms of even the values of investment on a yearly basis? I mean,
I think, on the one hand, there is that correlation when it comes to international investments, so valuations with wider markets that I've just discussed. But in general, I think Africa is very resilient, particularly when it comes to the actual structure and trajectory of businesses. Insofar as if a solution works, it works. If it really hits those pain points, it doesn't matter about the price of oil or global recession. And I think on that basis, we've actually seen the Big Four do surprisingly well, reflected in the investment levels, but also general economic growth over the past year or thereabouts. Because looking at the startup scene in particular, the successes are real successes. There's not that kind of almost crypto-like volatility, which is based on less. So, I mean, I think it's obviously important to consider, and I imagine better wider macroeconomic conditions they could be doing better, but the resilience is nonetheless obvious.
Okay, if you go just ask more questions in the second part of how you select companies, how you select founders, then we'll open for questions as well from everyone here. So basically, let's stand like from the other side and then say, if you were to invest in a company in Sudan, of course you have specific sectors, priorities, but what would be the minimum type of characteristics, traction that would be interested to look into businesses out of Sudan to give them 500 or 700,000 or even $1 million ticket size to invest in the company? How you usually also invest in exchange of how many equity?
Of course.
What type of vehicle? Is it safe? Is it direct equity? Is it debt and equity? Just would like to understand.
Of course,
more.
yeah, no, absolutely. So, I mean, in terms of, I guess, what we look for from a very basic perspective, an MVP as minimum is typically where we go because, at least from an Adverse side and to a certain extent Future Hub as well, it's not pure incubation in the way that many other kind of funds do. It's more sort of towards the acceleration side of things. That is to say, the MVP is there. There's some base traction, base revenue. It doesn't need to be a lot, but at least proven use cases. That is to say, the business is working, and indeed this is how it works. So that's very important for us to look at. In terms of the way we invest, I mean, again, every round is structured differently, so it's difficult to pin down an exact ticket size. You know, we can invest a certain amount ourselves. We have a lot of partner investors that we can bring in if something is working well. But at least, let's say from a blockchain side, one thing we've been focusing on recently, which I think is really interesting, is working with, say, Web 2 companies that want to move to Web 3 and working in sort of more an advisory capacity with them. I mean, naturally, that would require, I guess, more emphasis on the MVP and the use cases. But in instances like that, it would typically be so a safe as standard. And then we'd also look to get a side letter with some kind of advisory allocation in there as well. I mean, blockchain aside, I mean, safe is typically standard, just given the stage at which the rounds are at that we seek to enter.
I will go back to something you mentioned, structuring your deal and advisory.
Mm-hmm.
How important for you is making advisory type of work and actually working with the companies as mandatorily as it is to give the capital?
Oh, massively. I think it's actually more important in most cases. So I think to a certain extent, we try and position ourselves as strategic partners more than we do investors per se, because you hear these stories, and there's been a few in Africa, I think, I can't remember the exact names, but a couple in Nigeria, these companies who they'll raise 25 million, no problem, and then collapse 3 months later. I mean, the founder's very happy because his bank account is looking good, but the company no longer exists because they raise a huge amount, but there's no support network to go with it, there's no advisory services, and they're just kind of left to flounder, basically. At the same time, some of the most successful companies and the ones that actually we enjoy speaking to most say, don't really care about the ticket size. We just want more doors opened in terms of investment. We want more strategic advice and guidance, and we want more connections within the ecosystem. And that's really positive because not only does it show that they're serious when it comes to the actual business model, but also it's going to be a more fruitful relationship whereby we can work with them, which is beneficial to both parties. But we also know that they're going to really run with the resources we give them.
Yeah, thank you for this. I think a follow-up question on this is, to which extent for you, like someone who invests across the continent, is to have first-time founders, some specific investors or like entities on their cap tables before you do your investment? Is this something mandatory, or you just the strategy is just go on and be the first on the cap table as an investor?
Yes, I mean, so typically we don't lead rounds per se, but that doesn't mean we can't be the first investor. I mean, primarily, as long as there's like a clear plan from the company to actually seek further capital, and this is who we're looking to speak to, this is who we are speaking to. Even can you introduce us to these companies or funds? We're very happy to be the first investors, and in a couple of cases we have been.
Can we elaborate more on this just for everyone
to
understand what we mean by having a clear plan, having a strategy to raise the second round after this?
Yeah, exactly. So I think, as I mentioned in the initial presentation, the idea of having a roadmap is really important, not only in terms of product growth, but also in terms of business development and business strategy. So I guess at a micro level, if we have a conversation, you're raising a pre-seed round. If I ask the question, well, sort of who else are you speaking to? What's the plan for the round? It's always really positive to hear, well, we're speaking to, let's say, these VCs, or we're focusing more on family offices, or we want local investors more than we do international ones. Effectively consideration as to how the money's going to be raised and where it's going to come from. Particularly when there's that kind of qualitative, we want, say, more tech VCs than we do non-tech VCs, because it shows that, again, there's that emphasis on partnership more than just, give me money and give me it quickly. Then in terms of future rounds, I think that's always really helpful to see, purely because there's a long-term vision for the company, insofar as we're going to raise, say, a pre-seed now, and then in 6 months' time, we're going to start opening up the seed round, because the founder wants the company to last 6 months. There's no risk of a quick exit, basically, and everyone loses out. So yeah, it's kind of less, again, hard to quantify per se, but it's just an openness and an engagement with the wider investment community.
I think I also ask more questions also relate to characteristic and personalities of the entrepreneurs and different between a country and a country indeed. So I believe one of the weaknesses in the Sudanese ecosystem is the overall awareness about investment, but more importantly, the laws and the legal
Yes.
and the structure around that. Have you faced any major market issues of taking too much time in negotiations or like trying to give something and then due to the general awareness on the legalities took too much time in closing deals, or that's why you prefer more to follow on deals, not to leave deals?
Yeah.
How that work for you?
So yeah, I mean, there's a few points in there that I think worth touching on. The first of which is the kind of legal awareness is really key. So quite a lot of the time you'll speak to a great founder, a great company, early stage, but making good moves, and you say, well, can we see your data room, which is got financials, it's got regulatory documents, and the data room doesn't exist. And what that then means is it's not a hard red line, but it takes a lot more time, a lot more resources and money in a lot of cases to consult lawyers to build up that data room, which is why I think in the time leading up to investment, and also just for general due diligence and good business, you have to have a really solid paper trail of taxes paid, any arrears or debts you might owe, incoming, outgoing P&L, agreements signed, things of that nature. Because again, when you come across a company that doesn't have any of that or awareness of any of that, it just makes it far more difficult to actually commit. In terms of the kind of wider regulatory environment, I mean, it is often a challenge to invest directly in certain countries because there's a lack of trust, I think, with regulators and regulator engagement, such as that if we put our capital in a company based in this country, are we ever going to see it again? But again, it's very much a case-by-case basis, and there are ways around that, certainly in terms of company registration, etc., that I'm sure you're already aware of, that are good to think of.
Can we know your preferences in terms of countries of legally incorporated?
Yeah. Well, I mean, the classic, I think, for any startup is a Delaware registered entity. Is America. Yeah. Is the big one. So I think it depends what you're doing to a certain extent. So America as a base is great. If you're sort of more tech focused, Estonia, Dubai, Bahrain are very, very good. If you're looking to do anything more in the direction of blockchain, you've got the British Virgin Islands and Singapore. But one great thing about sort of multi-jurisdictional registration is it is exactly that. So you can have one entity, for example, a parent entity in Sudan, you can have another in Delaware, and then another entirely in Singapore or the British Virgin Islands, just depending on what you want to do. And then it's also great as well that you can funnel investment through one of those other entities, which again makes it easier for international investors.
One last question before moving there, I think. Have you in your previous portfolio isolated founders, taking founder from the CEO or seed, or like you ask for them, or you fully just be standing behind the founders in whatever decision they do? Like to which extent you did stuff like this?
So I mean, I think it's worth mentioning that the kind of accelerator type programs that we're running here, they're relatively new. So they've only been in existence for the past couple of months. And we've been really lucky so far. And I think it kind of stands testament to how we select companies in really having very cooperative relationship with all our founders. So particularly because there's that kind of advisory relationship, we work with as opposed to, I guess, behind, or indeed in front of, and establish more of a kind of collaborative vision. And indeed, when we actually look at investing seriously, the due diligence, the business due diligence as well, kind of really establishes basically where they want to go and what they want to do with the company. So it's not been an issue we've had to encounter seriously yet, but again, very much case by case, and I think flexibility is really key in Africa and in the startup system more generally.
All right, I'll open the floor. If anyone have any questions, please go ahead. Yeah.
I want to go back to the presentation that you presented. You talked about the sort of information that you provide to the investors when you're presenting your idea, especially for entrepreneurs and especially for first timers. Mm-hmm. You said that you have to be careful in the sort of data or information that you provide for them. Mm-hmm. So if you can give us like a clear maybe example of what sort of information to avoid mentioning in the presentation to a potential investor, and what sort of information is necessary to include.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'd emphasize more, including more rather than less, actually, insofar as maybe in terms of what to avoid, again, it's more difficult to say, but in terms of what to include, so anything with respect to traction, so number of users, revenue, if it's financial, volume of transactions, and then also breaking that down as well is really interesting. So for example, customer acquisition cost, customer retention, and then also what's great to see is active users versus non-active users. So you might have a platform that has 50,000 signups, of which only 1,500 are active. Now, there could be an argument to say, well, don't include that, it doesn't look good, but it'll be found out eventually. But nonetheless, it's very helpful to actually show that purely because it gives a greater insight as to the way it works. Similarly, when it comes to financials, if your product, for example, has multiple angles to it, so one B2B, one B2C, it's great to see how those break down. Basically, the way I describe it is like deconstruction, as in assume that the person looking at it has only just learned to read and put everything out there for them, so that they can see it very easily and understand it from those figures. But yeah, to sum up, traction and revenue are the two big areas. In terms of what to avoid, I guess it's more up to you, but I think the more the better, personally.
Any more questions?
عندي سؤال لكن عايزة أصيغه بالعربي وأنت
اتفضل.
ترجمه لي. إحنا كالناس اللي بيشتغلوا منتجات يدوية دي أفضل نوع لاستثمار أو أفضل حاجة إحنا ممكن نطلعها عشان هو بيتكلم عن البلوك تشين وبيتكلم عن الفينتك والحاجات دي صح؟ ما بتنفع معنا إحنا. يلا إحنا أنا ممكن أجيب استثمار كيف؟
Yeah. So her question is basically for businesses that do manufacturing, retail, and etc. It's basically the first generation of small business or medium business
Yes.
merging into adding this scalability within. How you see their natural growth to be to transform into more scalable business model? Do you see like whatever formal business model you saw that these small and medium enterprises businesses actually were able to be a startup at a certain point?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I think what a lot of it comes down to is so let's take so small and so SMEs, let's say retail, manufacturing. It's about keeping relevant and keeping present. That is to say, they're customer focused, they're B2C by and large, such that the needs of the needs of the customer have to be at the forefront of the model. So when it comes, for example, to advances in the financial sector or advances in e-commerce, let's say, the real success stories you see when it comes to that kind of the first line of startups, as you mentioned, are ones that keep relevant and keep up to speed with that. And I think more acutely looking at, say, for example, partnerships, collaboration, and integration is huge as well, because it's very rare that you come across, say, more siloed companies that might just, for example, do retail or just do manufacturing, build everything themselves in-house. There's always so if we look at the other side, Paystack or Flutterwave, there's always that level of integration. So I think it's just being aware of the market and the direction of that market.
So most of, if I could like summarize this, most of the scalability that happened to that was basically integrating mobile money or like fintech component within that, or e-commerce that allowed them to scale at bigger size.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's not like a rule insofar as it's not the case that like, to scale you must have fintech. Not at all. It's more, how can you keep yourself relevant as a platform? And actually, I think by taking that as a mantra, you can actually lead the tech charge without necessarily building the tech yourself. Look at the Amazon example. I think that illustrates this really well.
Yes, absolutely. Anyone have questions?
Yes. Actually, I'm very interested in NFTs, blockchain, and this kind of technologies. And I'm always wondering, in Africa, is there a lot of startups that's starting doing like stuff in fintech, like decentralized finance, and NFTs and metaverse also? Can you give us some numbers about the startup in Africa?
Yes, I mean, in terms of exact numbers, I mean, I'll be able to circulate something afterwards that has them in terms of precision. But what I can say, and this is what I found, maybe more anecdotal, is that particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, you can go to any town, any city, and you can host an event. And if you put blockchain in the title of that event, you'll get 400 people turning up, no question,
Okay.
right? And the energy surrounding blockchain, and particularly decentralized finance, is huge. So I think it's out of all kind of, I think it was like fintech investment in Nigeria, which is something like 300 or 400 million, I think, last year.
400 million only for the investment.
I think it might have just been fintech in particular. A significant portion of that was blockchain related fintech. I mean, again, I'll circulate the figures, but it was a hefty amount, because I mean, as I mentioned earlier, the importance of finance and money and the relevancy of blockchain and DeFi to finance and money means that it's just quite a natural fit. And so, yeah, huge opportunity, definitely.
Okay.
But I'll be able to get some more precise figures in terms of numbers as we had with the general sector for you afterwards.
Okay.
Yeah.
Also, another question about the struggles that you face, like in Sudan here, the government like against decentralized finance, and they don't. The regulation here is not adapted to that technologies. For what is your roles in this for the government?
Yeah.
Is there something that can be?
I mean, I think for entrepreneurs, it's always very important to work with rather than against regulators. And I think in all sectors, it's always a case of slightly pushing in a way that, like a rubber band, extends as opposed to just trying to cut through directly. So that's really important to bear in mind. From a government perspective, I think engagement is really important. Actually, from both perspectives, it's always about engagement and interaction, because the problems arise when everyone is doing things in darkness separately to one another, and there's misunderstanding, there's lack of communication, and that's when you get these laws brought in and businesses shut down, accounts frozen. But I think that if there's that always collaboration between stakeholders and regulators, you get, so I think with Tahal, that's how that came about, whereby the government saw that actually this is creating jobs, it's creating business, generating a lot of money, and they saw the good in it as a result and legalized it. And I think it's the same when it comes, for example, to blockchain or fintech. It's just a gradual process of engagement and education as well to get there.
Thank you so much for the presentation. You mentioned at the beginning that the company you invest in as Adverse and Future Hub, they have to have a base traction as a base revenue, base number of customers. I think have an MVP. Can you quantify what this base mean? How much money, how much customer, how much revenue, how much?
Yeah, I think the only real quantification I can do is MVP. As in, if you've got an MVP, then yes, the conversation can absolutely happen. In terms of customers and revenue, etc., obviously it's kind of difficult to say, because if you're a B2B product, you might have 4 customers but be doing $500,000 a month. Whereas if you're sort of customer orientated, you might have 1,000 customers and be doing $13,000 a month. So you can't put a number on it, but I think just a general rule, as long as there's an MVP and it works, we can start to have the conversation. But obviously, the more traction, the more customers and revenue, the better, naturally. If that kind of generally makes sense. MVP first, and then everything else is a bonus.
Maybe a follow up here.
Yeah.
How you deal with markets that has a lower purchasing power? So it could be thousands and thousands of transactions, yet all the revenue collectively could be like $7,000 a month. Well,
I think actually they're some of the most exciting markets, because you can make your product offering a lot more diverse, because if your customer acquisition cost is very low and average transaction is very low, there's a huge emphasis on actual customer acquisition and high and sort of low cap, high volume. So I think that drives innovation in quite interesting ways, insofar as how can you maximize utility of the platform such that people are going to do more through you. And similarly as well, how do you make it so easy and convenient to use such that someone is, for example, going to do 10 $1 transactions a day and keep up that spending power through the platform. I mean, in terms of business model in that instance, I think it would rely on those 2 parts, which is how can you make it a competitive product suite that makes people want to use it, and how can you make it easy enough such that people can use it in high volumes. So if you look at the success, for example, of mobile money in East Africa, that's testament to that, whereby the actual cap of each, the value of each transaction is tiny, but it's just massive in volume. But there's so much you can do with mobile money, which is very different, say, for example, to, let's say, over-the-counter, business-to-business, crypto FX transactions, which are very simple, but, each transaction is huge. Yeah, I think that the former case is more exciting than the latter, definitely.
So you believe that even in a very low markets, huge transaction, you could give someone like, you deliver food and you could deliver medicine, so you can have one customer because you acquire a lot with a very low value. And this, for you as investors, it's attractive to invest in a country where acquisition cost is actually very, very low.
Yeah, yes, because I think typically where acquisition cost is very low, there's more scope to innovate in an interesting and novel way. And that's always the most exciting thing to see. It's building that narrative and that story, which is, this is what we aim to do and this is what we can do. So yeah, definitely.
Go ahead.
In the context of Africa, how much weight does the healthy bottom line represent for you in contrast to scalable revenue growth?
It's a good question. I think it's worth considering in light of the fact that the majority of startups and companies in Africa are very early stage, such that you have to, I think, place more weight on scalability than you do necessarily on the core profitability from the off. I mean, if you were looking at a later stage company in Europe, of course, profitability is absolutely key because the business model has to be developed. But the scope of, say, a later stage company in Europe to actually acquire new customers, as you see in Africa, is extremely limited. So, at least kind of speaking more personally from what I've seen, I think scalability is absolutely fundamental. But at the same time, one area that companies often fall into, typically those actually who involve themselves in mobile money and last mile payments, is customer acquisition at any cost, which is like burn every month will be 20K, revenue will be at most 10, but they've got like 1 million users or something. So yeah, it definitely has to be a middle ground. But I think to a certain extent, certain business models lend themselves better to that middle ground than others. So it's, yeah, it may be difficult to create a hard and fast rule, but you can't neglect either, fundamentally.
What does early stage refer to in terms of how many years?
Well, I mean, in terms of, say, fundraising rounds, so typically seed, so pre-Series A, fundamentally, and at least in Africa.
Can we quantify in investment amount?
Oh, yeah, so I would say raising under 2 million, typically. Under $2 million, yeah. So pre-Series A under $2 million. In terms of time, under a year maybe in existence, or 2 years often.
Welcome, Sudan.
Thank you.
My question is about when you don't choose startup, what you want to avoid in startup, the deal breaker. And the second question is the lead time between the first meeting and the injection time of the employee.
Yeah, absolutely. So I mean, in terms of what we look to avoid in red flags, as I kind of mentioned, it's that like real excitement about the capital injection, which we're very wary of, and you can always kind of sense it in founders, which is where the priority is on getting the money, as in we want huge. They want to raise huge amounts of money at often quite a low valuation. The emphasis is only on actually acquiring the capital without, say, for example, a plan as to what to do with that capital, without a solid business model, without the roadmap, as I've mentioned. So that's always an immediate red flag, and in most cases a deal breaker as well. I mean, aside from that, it's also like a regulatory question too, which is, if you're doing something which is brazenly not necessarily illegal, but a grey area to the point whereby it's going to be impossible to grow the business without either going to jail or having your accounts frozen. Not sure what's worse in some cases, but it's not something that we can really engage with. In terms of timeline, we typically
As a red flags.
As other red flags, cool.
Let's have another 2 or 3.
Another 2 or 3. Okay, gotcha. We'll go through. Yeah, cool. So I would say lack of a solid team. So it's great, for example, to be a sole founder, and like there's a great nobility about that, and I get it. But If you don't, for example, have like a CTO if you're a tech company, if you don't have an operating officer, if you're seeking to scale very, very soon, and there's no sort of support network, basically, it suggests that the company's not at a stage whereby it's ready to actually produce even short-term, let alone long-term growth. So lack of a solid team is one. But what I would say about team, in contrast to the others, is it's something that can actually quite easily be fixed in time. It's not necessarily a red flag, as in we're not going to touch you, we don't want anything to do with you. It's more just, maybe come back later when you've got that sorted. Other than that, I think quite often, particularly in the tech and the blockchain space, you come across companies that don't necessarily have a solid selling point, which sounds strange, but it'll be often quite a convoluted decentralized finance or convoluted, we're a digital investment fund, or some kind of basically pyramid scheme wrapped up in the form of a very nice pitch deck and a very buzzword heavy pitch. And the thing is, as great as it may sound, as great as it may look, again, when you're engaging with these guys, it's kind of very obvious within the first about 5 minutes that something's not right. And then you'll eventually get through to the metrics and the revenue, which don't really exist, or it's been very weirdly sort of set out. Now, it's not always malicious. Quite often it's just maybe lack of guidance. But yeah, no clear plan or clear what you're actually trying to do is another big one too. I mean, by and large, the red flags are pretty common sense insofar as like if it looks bad, it kind of is bad. There's no kind of hidden oh, you stepped on a landmine kind of thing. You didn't know about it. But yeah, it is literally much like what you need to show investors. It's very obvious what you shouldn't be showing or doing to them as well. So basically, if you think it's unwise, it probably is unwise. Yeah.
The second,
second one, yes, exactly. In terms of timeline, yeah, absolutely. So we typically at least aim, if everything goes well, from first meeting to injection of funds about a month or thereabouts. And so the way it breaks down is first meeting, which is like an introductory call, talking through the deck, the business model, going over the kind of fundamentals, at least of the business. And then if things seem strong or promising, there'll be a second call, normally about a week later, with the investment committee, which is sort of the partners and the parent companies, etc. That'll be slightly longer, and it'll be going over some of the fundamentals that were discussed in the first call, but perhaps with more depth in certain areas and probing the finances a bit more deeply. If all goes well and we want to invest, we'd make a soft commitment, which would be sort of a certain check size, dependent on obviously due diligence going well and completing. And also, the negotiations going through. I mean, we've never had an issue at this point, so 99.99% of the time, it's always fine. We'd then open up to due diligence, where our lawyers would send over a checklist, and this is why it's so important to have a data room, as I mentioned, because it's normally stuff like employment contracts, your profit and loss over the past year or so, or however long you've been in existence, any debt or agreements you have signed with other parties. It's effectively setting that out. I mean, that's typically reviewed after about a week. At the same time, contract negotiations are ongoing. It's normally just standardization of terms, basically, nothing too in-depth or novel. And all in all, about 4 weeks, and then transfer happens.
I'll ask you questions here.
Yeah.
A month.
Yeah. A month, yeah, exactly.
In the best scenario.
Pardon?
In the best scenario.
Best scenario, yes, about a month. We're typically about a month, actually. I'll say maybe 5 weeks, but
I will ask another question. You mentioned that the deal room need to be ready.
Yes.
So let's assume the deal room wasn't ready.
Yeah.
Would you just pass on the deal?
No, not at all. It would just take more time, is the thing. So, I mean, our lawyers are typically very good insofar as they'll work with companies and saying, well, you need your registration documents, you need your profit and loss sheets and whatever else. And we obviously give them time to put them together. And a lot of the time, if they're a very new company or they might be inexperienced founders, which is not an issue necessarily, they won't be able to produce these documents, in which case we'll kind of make a measured decision and say, well, everything else is in place, they just don't have these, that's fine, we'll overlook it. Yeah.
And another counter question before coming back to the other question is, are your offers a standard offer, so you take it or leave it? Or you have some sort of flexibility discussing?
Yeah, no, it's massively flexible. I mean, it's very much on a case-by-case basis. So there would be, it also depends on what the actual founder wants. So for example, if we were discussing with like a later stage, a Series A company doing the leaders in the space doing massive volume.
Million.
Exactly. We probably wouldn't have much room to be able to say, oh no, please change this, change that. And that's fine. But if it's an earlier stage company that we're going to have to put more time and effort into helping, we would naturally want to have a bit more give in that instance because, you know, we're giving more as well. But yeah, I mean, as I've mentioned, we've never had an issue in that respect, and we've always managed to find solutions. So yeah, we're very flexible.
And there was a question.
Yeah, you were talking about blockchain and NFTs earlier. I wanted to ask if you encountered any real use cases for NFTs startups in Africa specifically who are using NFTs in a very small.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's good you've raised that actually, because I think NFTs have a particularly bad rep for just sort of being novelties more than use cases. So a company we spoke to recently and are hoping to do more with, based in Nigeria, where land registry, as it may be in Sudan as well, I don't know, is a big issue, whereby if you come to buy a property, you don't necessarily know that the person you're buying it from has the right to be selling it. Similarly, then when you do go to buy it, you don't necessarily know that it's not, for example, been repossessed, doesn't have debt attached to it, it's not a mortgage dispute. And the way you find that out, obviously, is by going to the registry office and finding it and checking that it's all in good shape. The problem in Nigeria, at least, is that the registry office is thousands and thousands of files of often very old bits of paper. So, I mean, we recently just rented an office in Lagos, and it took a very long time to find. It's quite a tall, recognisable building to actually find that slip of paper for what should be a really obvious landmark. So what this company is doing is effectively working with property developers to load plots of land on chain as NFTs, which makes them not only digitized and searchable, but also very easily verifiable. And then when you come to sell them, you can actually transfer the deed as you would any other digital asset, making the whole process seamless. So that's a great one I've seen. In terms of others, I mean, supply chain digitization with NFTs is great. There's another company based in Nigeria that are working, I think, in Sierra Leone at the moment on their ports to be able to produce cargo tracking notes and end-user certificates as NFTs such that they can be instantly verified by counterparties. Because at least with commodities at the moment, the problem is that the whole value chain is very, very long and very, very difficult. So, I mean, I'd say at the moment, anything that's basically involving digitization, NFTs have a huge use case for. A last point I'll mention as well, which is slightly different, there's a couple of startups in Africa when it comes to authentication, particularly with respect to tickets. Again, huge use case for NFTs, and the idea to then turn those tickets into something collectible and monetizable. I mean, that's sort of more the kind of more gentrified consumer end of things than, say, the actual use cases, but still, you know, they're doing well.
Yes. Actually, I have two questions regarding founders and market size. For founders, let's say there's those two friends graduating from college and deciding to build a startup.
Mm-hmm.
How they should show the potential in themselves as the founders? Is it by traction, the product they build, or the network and advisors around them, or without previous experience they have? The next question about market size is, let's say we're working in the e-commerce market, and the market is not worth the $1 billion, but we are planning 2 years or 3 years from now to build some product like fintech product to work closely with the e-commerce product to serve the same target market and bringing more values and more money. Is it this approach worth to mention in the investors meeting or in the pitch deck?
Yes, in terms of the first question about sort of co-founders, I mean, I think the greatest testament to potential is you know, the work and the progress which is made. I mean, so obviously it comes down to each set of co-founders individually, but you know, if you develop an MVP, if you build up the fundamentals of the business together, that suggests that, you know, you are on the same page in terms of future vision and alignment, and that obviously bodes well for the future. So I think, yeah, actual application is very important there, as well as kind of the general presentation, I guess, of the company. I mean, if you've got the common background, then that sort of bodes a lot better than if you kind of met on LinkedIn or something, which happens more often than you'd think. In terms of the second question, yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's always very important to have a roadmap. So it might be the case that, you know, you've got the KPIs, the key performance indicators for this quarter and the next quarter, and then mentioning that, you know, if all goes well, say after this raise, we'll be able to onboard this many users, acquire on that basis this amount of volume and therefore this amount of revenue. And with that, we'll then be able to introduce this e-commerce aspect. I mean, it might be the case that the more investors you speak to and the more you explore the actual future of the product, you see that they're more interested in the kind of e-commerce digitized side of things. So you bring that more into the actual business model. I mean, a lot of it comes down to just being reactive too, insofar as if something's not working, don't be stubborn about it, get rid of it, and keep chopping and changing as is feasible to do so. But yeah, absolutely. I mean, if that was something that was on the roadmap, make it very clear, because an investor can look at it and go, great, that's where it's going. Cool.
My question is, after the investment, what is the follow-up process that you prefer to take? Do you like to be in the kitchen with the founders, or it's just like you prefer to have a meeting every 3 or 6 months?
Yes, I think it largely depends on how developed the business is. I mean, if it's later stage, then it'll more just kind of be checking in and keeping in touch, assessing performance indicators and that kind of thing. If it's earlier stage, which is kind of actually what we prefer to look at, even within the early stage umbrella, it's more definitely intensive when it comes to the actual capital, time, and resources spent. Particularly if, for example, from the Web3 perspective, you were looking to go from Web 2 to Web 3, our sort of selling point is actually being there and doing it with you, pairing you up with mentors and advisors and that kind of thing. So yeah, I mean, I'd say we're definitely more heavy-handed than less, but obviously it depends on the nature of the company and also what the founder wants as well. I mean, I kind of say you should always go for partnership, but often it is just the capital that's needed, and that's not necessarily an issue.
In terms of the term sheet, are you interested in board seats, veto rights, or is it like a standard negotiation?
I mean, with us, because we go earlier stage and we don't lead rounds, we typically don't really go for the actual kind of nitty-gritty of the kind of constitutional influence. A lot of other investors do, but with us, it's a very standard term sheet. And normally, at least from a kind of if it's blockchain, it will have some kind of, say, token terms, because that's just what we look at. When it's not blockchain, it's very much standardized. There's nothing too hard-hitting in there.
There's something that will come up to this question. So what you mean by it's not leading around means he doesn't do the negotiation, the diligence, and so kind of they follow on with someone that's leading the deal, so they will contribute in that. So this is what means of leading and not leading around. But my question is, when you join in after, how much you usually take into from the carry of the deal, or you don't do carry in that deals?
In terms of the
like a return profits, and then, or you just joining with the chair and the lead investor?
Yes, yeah. Well, so it's at least in terms of the actual, let's say a safe. If it's a safe, the safe will be that which is set by the lead investor, because of course it's in the name, it's a standard agreement, right? So it should be standardized between all parties. And then if, for example, we wanted, let's say, information rights, or for whatever reason we did want a board seat, we then put that in the term sheet or the side letter, because at least in terms of structure, safe is, as I mentioned, standard. And then if you want any kind of special arrangements, you put it in the term sheet and the side letter.
Is it common that you set valuation cap for the safe, or this is also being set by the lead investor?
Yeah, so I mean, typically the company in connection and collaboration with the lead investor will set a valuation cap, and that's the one we work at. I mean, at least for us and most other investors, the really important thing is to be aware that, and to know that we're working at the same valuation cap as everyone else, because it's never great to know that other people are getting better terms than you for no good reason. So yeah, which does happen, quite often.
Even if you come after him?
Pardon?
Even if you come after him?
Yeah. So I mean, it is often the case that to get like a first investor over the line, companies will often lower the valuation cap a bit and give them a nice nudge, which exactly does happen. There's nothing wrong with that. But the problem kind of comes around is when you're locked in and signed, and then another investor comes in with half the valuation cap you do. You just think, what's going on? Or at least they hide it very well when it does happen. I've not noticed it, but yeah.
And also follow on this. So let's say we typically put between $500,000 to $700,000 on a safe.
Yeah.
What typically is the MVB based, post MVB?
Yeah.
Let's say in a blockchain or crypto.
Yeah.
What typically is the valuation cap that you would prefer always to go into?
So let's say it's a seed raise, for example. You've got some. Okay, I'll give a couple of options, right? So if it's very early stage, if it's pre-seed to seed, that is to say an MVP, some basic users, anywhere between 750 and 1.2 million.
750 to
Yeah, it's to 1.2 million. I mean, that is of course where there is the MVP, the users, a bit of traction coming. Let's say it's more established. You've got the business model. You're on the up basically. You just need the capital to do it, and it's proven. Up to about 10 million, and then valuation, yeah. And then beyond that, I mean, Series A, yeah, I mean, up to 15 and beyond, basically. I mean, Series A is, I find at least, where things get a bit more extrapolated, and you have some companies at Series A with 15 million valuation cap, others with like a 60. Because of course, what you've got to consider is that actually investment rounds are not always linked to progress. So some very good companies might have like 2 or 3 seed rounds, for example, just because it avoids them diluting or giving away, too much. Yeah. So it's also about being quite crafty, because I mentioned that investors are very devious, which is true. But at the same time, you can, give a bit of to and fro as well to make sure that things are structured the way you want.
Then, yeah. Go ahead. And then
Assuming that the papers are all fine, you have an account, everything's clear.
Mm-hmm.
Is the dispersal cash 100%, or is there like a tranche system? Or how does it
Yeah. Again, it depends on the project. So, I mean, we typically, I think just because of the nature of who we've invested in, it's upfront all at once. But with one investment we made, which was maybe less certain from a sector perspective, that's to say they had plans to do all this tech integration, but it wasn't there yet. It was a total ticket size of 250K. We invested 50K initially, and then in the term sheet we set out, provided that conditions A, B, C, D are met within 3 months, we will give the extra 200K.
What was the exact case?
So it was effectively a property platform that was looking to integrate NFTs in a way that actually made sense, which is rare for NFTs. And the conditions we set on that basis were, it was like it was a general term, but made good progress on the tokenomics NFT white paper within 3 months. It was like having sort of submitted filed tax returns just to show that they were continuing to do business within 3 months. And then I think the third one was just kind of more to do with tangible business development in that time as well. And on that basis, yeah, it was paid.
But then
I'm sorry, I came late, so I just want to understand your thoughts about the dynamic NFT, and have you seen any projects here in the region, like companies actually implementing the dynamic NFTs?
Yes, I mean, Egypt, strangely, is a really ripe market for NFTs and like dynamic NFTs by extension. And I think one of the great powers that NFTs have for those interested in blockchain from like a business perspective is that if, say, the jurisdiction or the region or the market is a bit iffy when it comes to tokens or cryptocurrency, NFTs are actually a really nice way to circumvent that, but whilst at the same time integrating blockchain principles. So, I mean, not so far, at least in Sudan. I mean, maybe shortly after some of the conversations we'll have here, but Egypt in particular, I think anywhere basically with an entertainment market and a general consumer appetite for like digital solutions can not only integrate NFTs but also kind of go beyond with the more, I guess, dynamic stuff as you've mentioned.
What was the implementation of the dynamic NFT? Could you please give us an example of projects?
Yeah, so I mean, it's still kind of underway, but basically it's based in Egypt. It's a digital marketing and sort of media brand, working with obviously larger multinationals that want to integrate kind of dynamic NFT principles. So to a certain extent, it's done case by case. However, almost better example actually outside of this region in South Africa, a company called Moment, who we invested in. It's less dynamic per se, but what they've really pioneered is like the one-click NFT system. So they work very closely with kind of big businesses, companies, multinationals. And they've developed a technology whereby with one click, they can just mint 1,000 NFTs, which say that company can then do what they want with in terms of QR-based this or metaverse-based that. So yeah, it's actually a very good point you raised, because most solutions have been kind of B2B. And I think the kind of B2C side of things does rely on like the maturity of the market when it comes to the digital solutions. But yeah, who knows? Yes.
last question, Sophia.
Okay, what types of exit pathways do you prefer?
Yeah, very good question, and one at the moment which we're still sort of working out. When it comes to, say, the Web3 stuff, so I've mentioned a couple of times that we're quite into the tokens and token issuance, and that's exit related, because in any early stage company, and particularly African early stage companies, it's often very difficult to exit, because it'll be so long before shares are generated that you can't then sell them. So having, say, for example, tokens makes it much easier to exit positions. I mean, because we, as I said, go quite early and seek to be quite hands-on with most of our founders, we're not in a position really anywhere near to actually look at exiting yet. So yeah, with the Web2 stuff, it's similar too, because there are a few actually investors like this. I mean, less so us, because we kind of see not the horror stories, but the other side of it, whereby there's one who remain nameless in Nigeria that have done exactly this. They go in, they invest in 120 companies in a year, and then they realize, we've run out of dry powder and there's no way we can actually now get out of this. So it's not bad, because the company's good investments, they're doing well, but they've just got to sit for 5 to 10 years and wait for hopefully something to happen. But yes, I mean, it's kind of a combination of the two. Tokens are very helpful, but a lot of the time it's just sitting and waiting.
Last question, yes.
Okay, we have a case, 2 cases.
Yeah.
Companies that have $25,000 monthly revenue.
Mm-hmm.
They're safe, $50,000.
Mm-hmm.
What is the valuation gap? The other,
Yeah.
compare.
Yeah.
The other startup with the same field.
Yeah.
$25,000 revenue, monthly revenue.
Uh-huh.
200K investment and the safe. What is the valuation cap? Zillions.
Yeah. No, you're putting me to the test, because with valuations, it's a whole. People. There are people who are dedicated. They'll do valuations.
It's a deal breaker.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the thing is that valuations are often negotiable. Insofar as, speak to a company, they'll give you a valuation. It's stupidly high. You say that's stupidly high. What are you basing it on? And then you kind of call their bluff, right? And they say, actually, nothing really. You can halve it. In those two instances, if you've got a company that's doing 25K in revenue a month, I mean, it'd be. We need to know what the revenue actually is. Is that? I mean, how many customers are producing that revenue? B2B, let's say. Okay, B2B, 25K a month in pure revenue. Okay. I mean, let's say, yeah.
I think here we need to know more about the market size.
Yeah. Yes. It's okay. Let a ballpark figure. Put it sort of 1.2 million, for example. If it's B2B, I'll say that. But no, you're exactly right. You would need to know more details, because the reason I say let's say 1.2 for a B2B solution is because typically that 25K is probably far fewer customers doing much higher volume transactions. And obviously, if you lose one of those customers, you'll be doing 15K a month, and suddenly it loses half its value. If it's 25K a month based off mobile money, $1 per transaction subscriptions, great. That value's just gone 10 times exactly. So yeah, it does depend. But I mean, that's an interesting point in itself. As to how you actually value these companies.
The other case.
Pardon? The other
case, 25.
So yeah.
$25,000 monthly.
Yes. So 200,000 of investment, basically.
Yeah, investment.
I mean, if it was B2B as well, probably similar, to tell the truth. Because I mean, if you have a 1.2 million valuation, raising 200K is kind of reasonable. If you've only raised 50K, actually, you probably bring the valuation down much less, to maybe 500K. Yeah. I mean, obviously, it depends on what you want to do. It's kind of difficult to say, but yeah. Hopefully, that's vaguely helpful.
Perfect. Thank you so much, William. I think this was absolutely
Thank
amazing.
you.